I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I think it's really been an excellent interdisciplinary, intercultural experience for me. As the chair just pointed out, my paper is titled as A Case of Plural Modernity, Revisiting the Political in Bhutan. Now, I thought before I get directly to my paper, let me share with you, or perhaps I would like to share with you my relationship with both Bhutan and Buddhism. I've always had an inclination towards Buddhist philosophy. In fact, it was in the early 2000s that I came across and got more familiarized with the Lotus Sutra of Mahayana Buddhism. And since then, I've only gotten more inspired by its profundity to explain life and human nature through the concept of dependent origination, which is also known as Ichinen Sanzen, which means 3,000 realms in a single moment of life. Well, this personal journey some years later got into the understanding of a country which had a very distinct Buddhist cosmological vision and culture. So since 2006, I started looking into Bhutan's political and diplomatic affairs. And for some years, I was closely following Bhutan's foreign policy as I was affiliated with a think tank which was under the Ministry of Defense in New Delhi. My last 10 years have been in a university where one of the larger themes that I've largely focused on is the intersection of strategy and philosophy. And today's paper is in many ways, I would say, a culmination of these different paths that I chose to follow in the last few years. And I hope that I have something interesting to offer you today. So, at the outset, I think it will be useful to begin my paper by unpacking a few words and bringing up front the central argument that I intend to make today. Let me start by clarifying the word plural modernity and also discuss the meaning and interpretation that I endow to the word political. Well, my understanding of modernity is inspired by the work of an African political theorist, Kwam Gaike, for whom both tradition and modernity are intertwined, and a binary distinction between tradition and modernity is often misplaced. While presenting a non-essentialist understanding of tradition, Gaike argues that modernity is not always the rejection of past and is constituted of ways and processes through which certain ideas become part of inherited traditions. This continuation of tradition, albeit in different forms, is interesting, which also exposes us to the epistemic engines which specific modern nation states located in different geocultural spaces create for themselves. And I would say that Bhutan is an excellent example of this interesting cultural experience. So when I invoke the term plural modernity, I employ it to reflect on this syncretic understanding where traditional values are often intertwined with modern categories. International relations has been considered as an ethnocentric discipline. It was not only built on the experiences of great powers of the West, but was also derived from Western political thought and philosophy. I therefore join the body of literature which argues that to decolonize knowledge in international relations, one needs to understand the different geographies of thought. One needs to understand the genre of epistemic practices which stem from Asian or non-Western traditions. One needs to understand the limitations of conceptual categories which fail to capture the different ways of thinking that exist in specific social cultural contexts. In this paper, I foreground the importance of situated knowledge and emphasize why local indigenous understanding of histories need to be taken seriously. However, I would also like to highlight the specific medium through which history and philosophy is communicated. I would like to invoke Gaike again here, who writes, "Philosophy is a cultural phenomenon, as philosophy often grapples with issues of their time. Therefore, philosophy is often embedded in human affairs. In the case of Bhutan, the medium which I choose to study the linkage between philosophy and society are folk stories. Engaging academically with folk stories, which has the power of conviction and persuasion, can help us go beyond the imperialism of conceptual categories like power, morality, order, justice, peace, war, which are often used in international relations. Thus, what I aim to do today is to understand not only how the political in Bhutan has been constructed, but also how it has been communicated in the public and the private domain. I draw my understanding of political from the vocabularies one often employs in Bhutan in everyday quotidian discourses and conversations, both official and non-official. For the purpose of this paper, I have chosen the concept or the notion or the term Sawa Sum, both as a vocabulary and a puzzle, which raises important, interesting questions to me as a researcher. Now, if one looks at the political and the religious history of Bhutan, Sawa Sum has had relevance for both spiritual and temporal affairs. Sawa Sum, in fact, is not the only vocabulary. There is Lechudre, Riglam Namza, Thadamshik, amongst others, which animate the public and private moral and spiritual space of Bhutan. Now, if one looks at the empirical and interpretive data which emerges or could emerge from such analysis, it would not be wrong to say that these terms can be potential sites of political contestation, as they would respond to different values, interests, narratives, ideologies, etc., of course, very differently. In order to give agency to these vocabularies and contextualize them in the broader philosophical framework that they were embedded in, I trace the genealogy of the term Savasum. I also elicit meanings of Savasum from the broader normative framework which was supported by the legal codes introduced in the 17th and 18th century. And I close by arguing how these ideas of the Dang Bu or the Ding Bu can be understood appropriately by trying to understand the narratives of folk stories in Bhutan. Quinzen Shoden writes, and I quote, "In the Bhutanese tradition, stories and legends are not told. They are unraveled and released, which means that storytelling is a continuous process, and to be released, stories must be alive and vibrant. This oral tradition of the Dang Bu and the Ding Bu, transmitted to one generation of the other, is thus continuing and living thread that links one generation to other." Narratives or stories are of course not unique to Bhutan. In fact, in South Asia, one does have the rich legacy of the Panchatantras, the Hitopadeshas, and even certain epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are written in the form of story in early India. One also has the Rannamari story of the Maldives or the Ceylonese folk tales. As one reads these stories, one arrives at the conclusion that often ideas, wisdom, strategy, philosophy, tactics in early South Asian tradition were often conveyed through stories. In fact, what is unique about these distinct traditions is the narrative style they often adopted to make sense of the world around, and how the meta-narratives were often intertwined with the micro-narratives. Michael Pike, Laurie Patton, Brian Black's work, I would say, exemplary in this field. Anchored to a specific cosmological vision, these different folk traditions, local stories, found expression in common beliefs, practices, and cultural elements of a specific social group. It is also most interesting to note that they were mainstream narratives and their vernacular versions. Often the umbrella framework which was reflecting in the broader philosophical vision was mimicked by vernacular versions. The macro narrative was the epistemic engine of what constituted proper behavior, right thinking, appropriate wisdom, and right action. In other words, stories became a communicative medium to pass down inherited wisdom to younger minds and generation. It also became a communicative medium to simplify big philosophical ideas, offering a vision to translate these insights into the everyday life and the reality of everyday life and behavior. The folk tradition of Bhutan becomes important as most of them come with an underlying moral tradition and moral reasoning. One can also say that the folk tradition of Bhutan were a via media, an intrinsic part of personal and public space where conversations could be held. This is important because given the difficult terrain of Bhutan and the challenges that the terrain must have posed to governance in terms of maintaining political and social order, These concepts can be considered as important factors holding additional normative value in terms of endowing domestic political order, importance of righteous thinking, building sensibilities of loyalty and belongingness, and also disciplining human nature. So it is against this backdrop that I've written this paper and have divided it into three broad sections. The first section offers an overview of the concept of power and authority in the backdrop of the political history of Bhutan. The political history of Bhutan is not divorced from its religious history. In fact, it was Shabdrung Gawang Namgyal who gave Bhutan its first codified laws, Chatrim as they were called, and the reflections can be seen in contemporary Bhutan in terms of the law codes that exist. In fact, one scholar Kappa writes, and I would like to quote him here, he says, the state laws play an important role in the maintenance of the teachings of the Buddha, and in a place where the teachings of the Buddha is flourishing, the subjects have the possibility to strive for liberation. Under the state law, one will attain Buddhahood. In 1907, when Bhutan became a hereditary monarchy from a theocratic state, the intellectual foundation of the religion and politics continued, but in a different manner, and was more precisely framed as the dual system of religion and politics chose Sydney. A scholar has noted, and I quote, when we investigate the unique form of politics in Bhutan, which captures the progressive culmination of both religion and politics, it becomes imperative to study the source behind it. The combination of religion and politics follows a mindful route of the middle path approach. This middle path, in Bhutanese context, is embedded around the context of the highest commitment, the Thatam Shek, Dejudre, which is the karmic revolution, and the Driglam Namza, which is orderly behavior. The purpose of middle path was also to achieve the happiness of people. Savasum, as I see it, which means the three jewels of Buddhism, become relevant in this context. Thus, in the second section, I focus on the genealogy of Savasum, a term which has a specific political and spiritual connotation. In Vajrayana Buddhism, they are also known as the three objects of refuge, the Buddha, the Dharma or his teachings, and Sangha or his followers. While there are many specificities which are added to the three jewels in Vajrayana and Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, these objects of fundamental refuge are fundamental to Buddhist practice. Karma Phuntsho writes, and I quote, in his ultimate continuum, Maitreya states, these jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, are difficult to encounter. They are stainless. They possess power. They are the ornaments of the world. They are supreme and they are changeless. Unquote. The term in the modern sense can be translated as three foundations of Bhutan, or the jewels of the state, the king, the country, and the people. The political meaning of Savasum has been translated as the political duty towards the king, the country, and the people, whereby metaphorically the king is considered to be wise and enlightened as the Buddha, Dharma is the obligation towards following one's duty, and Sangha is the community of believers, the people who are the citizens of Bhutan. How does all this translate to the everyday conversations of Bhutan? An appropriate entry point are the folk stories of Bhutan. Therefore, in the third section, I highlight the relevance of these ideas by looking at narratives, a form of communication which in many ways convey the sense that these vocabularies hold. While there are many sites in Bhutan which are reflective of both tradition and modernity, stories and dance drama, the Sichu, like the Acho Pento, stand out due to their communicative effectiveness. In this paper, I pick up on such examples like the story of four friends or the Meme Hele, which successfully represent some fundamental Buddhist Bhutanese values. My conclusion is that the concept of Savasum can be interpreted as a quintessential spirit, a conceptual umbrella framework which is the guidepost of action. It is therefore not divorced from the everyday life and thinking of an ordinary Buddhist. While it can be looked at from different frames, it is a meta-concept which disciplines the notion of political in Bhutan, which is inclusive of social, ecological, cultural, economic, and spiritual aspects associated with the maintenance and sustenance of social and political order. It also conveys the ideal type of qualities associated with the leader, which is the king, and any deviation from it is contrarian to Buddhist principles. Thus, once bereft from Buddhist values of interdependence and respect for the other, they would lose their essence and become empty, and vulnerable to politicization in the long term. If one casts a look at the multiple folk stories from Bhutan, such deviation is accompanied by grave consequences. Thus, I would like to submit by arguing that revisiting folklores and narratives in different geocultural spaces is insightful as they represent plural hybrid modernity. Works of Bhutanese writers and scholars like Dorji Penjor, Quinzang Choden needs to be taken seriously, as it not only bridges the gap between tradition and modernity, but also shifts our gaze to the question of inherited cultural tradition and how these cultural traditions have a significant, perhaps an alternative relational cosmovision to offer as we, I think, grapple with some of the very complex problems in 21st century. So that's where I would like to end.